So Gabija, welcome to the summit. For anybody that doesn't know you or isn't aware of your work, could you just tell us a bit about your background and the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you, Niall. Yeah, it's great to be here. So I'm a neuroscientist by training. I did research in different fields of neuroscience over the 10, 11 years. So firstly, I started with investigating vision and doing some research and data analysis of how brain records the vision and makes sense of it. Then I did research on Parkinson's disease in Finland, in Helsinki. And then I came to UK to do a PhD in navigation and memory. I did my PhD at UCL. And at UCL, I got the kind of real desire to start bringing the neuroscience insights into the kind of non-scientists, because I was getting so many insights, that, wow, this is like mind-blowing. How come, people outside of neuroscience community are not introduced to that? Because a lot of findings are written up in quite, detailed articles, which are accessible for mainly neuroscientists. So I started actually teaching in schools. I lectured, I created my own neuroscience course called My Brain During the Day for teenagers, and started basically teaching teenagers about their brain. And at the same time, I also was invited to become an internal performance at work and well-being at work coach at UCL. And some of my clients who weren't neuroscientists, my clients were like academics, administrative staff, members. And some of my clients who heard about my lecturing in schools kept asking me like, oh, could you actually talk to my team about those insights? And it kept reappearing. And when I started later on, I started my own performance and well-being coaching company. Some of my clients again kept asking me like, oh, can you come and deliver a lunchtime talk in my company about, any of those neuroscience things you talk to those teenagers? And I was like, okay, well, I'll give it a go, So I started doing those seminars, and the more I did it, the more people wanted it. So it's kind of just somehow naturally progressed. So what I do now, I lecture at Sheffield Hallam University in psychology department. I do lots of seminars for companies, and during the lockdown, actually, I've been doing a lot of seminars on how to adjust to these, changing times, and about how to maintain well-being and emotional health. And I still coach some clients, and I raise a little 2-year-old daughter.
Fantastic. So you mentioned there that you're doing some coaching on helping people to sort of navigate these difficult times during COVID. Just to start off, have you got any kind of practical advice for people that are going through a tough time at the minute, like just to sort of transition through COVID?
I think the main thing is creating safety. Because the brain naturally, especially the more ancient centers of the brain, they need predictability. They absolutely hate change. They hate when things are up in the air and you don't know what's going to happen when. And what we learned, during this pandemic, we can't predict anything. I mean, we have certain ideas, but we are not in control. And especially given that we kind of almost got the illusion of being in control of things before the lockdown, and with our lives being in that state of lack of control puts a lot of people really in unease, and that the reason being that one center of the brain called the amygdala and other more similarly ancient centers, they need more safety. So in order to create that, there is multiple of things we can do. So number one, having good daily habits. So having predictability within the day, because normal brain doesn't necessarily need, kind of knowing what's going to happen next. We need to bring it back to focusing now. Okay, well, I know that at this time I'm writing, at this time I'm playing with my daughter, at this time we're having dinner. And actually mammal brain really kind of gets soothed by that routine. So overall, having really, really good daily habits. And by the way, I found that a really useful practical advice also for people whose work situation has changed, not only during the lockdown, but overall, if somebody quits the job or gets fired, and suddenly they find themselves having too much time and not enough structure, to kind of make up your own structure. to fill the day with those habits is one of the things that help to reduce anxiety. And second, to complement that, is doing things that help to soothe the anxiety. So time in nature, gardening, physical exercise, even if it is actually just cleaning the house, something keeping physical every day, very important. And taking frequent breaks, if you're working and focusing on something, taking breaks often, just to move, to get some water, to just kind of give your brain enough recovery time so it doesn't get overworked. Because that links to the other issue people shared with me that they experienced during the lockdown, is overly acting brain, overly kind of brain which struggles to switch off. And frequent breaks really, really help with that. So that's just a quick answer. I can expand later on if you want to.
Very cool. That seems to be a common theme with a lot of the speakers we've interviewed. It's just the importance of feeling safe. Like, it's very hard to make changes in your life or to grow as a person if you don't have that fundamental need for safety met first. And that there seems to be some links in the brain there. Like, could you maybe expand a bit on that? Like, what's going on when we're not feeling safe?
Yeah. So if you look at the brain, this is like the brain and the actual, side by side to my brain. So this is the front part of the brain called prefrontal cortex. And that's the part which we need working really, really well in order to make sound decisions, in order to change habits, in order to kind of have good willpower, control emotions, reducing procrastination, and so on. So this part of the brain is the most important to kind of make sound judgments and create a lasting change. Now, inside of the brain, just in there, at the kind of the very middle, there is a part called amygdala and other structures which form so-called limbic system. And these are ancient areas that, kind of other mammals have very similarly functioning areas. And the job of limbic system, and in particular amygdala, is to detect any danger. Now, amygdala can't understand the modern world, so it freaks out very easily. And when it does so, it actually reduces the activity in prefrontal cortex, making it physically impossible for us to think rationally, to do the right thing, to kind of delay gratification, and so on and so forth. And as a result, we fall back into the old habits when that constantly happens. Now, sometimes it's obvious. So imagine if somebody says something that really, really makes you furious, and you get really angry at the moment. It suppresses your prefrontal cortex, and you say the thing that is much, much more mean that you would really intend to say normally, right? Or you might even do something like, I don't know, throw something on the floor in that impulse. So that's the kind of the so-called acute deactivation of prefrontal cortex. Now, a lot of us have much lesser level of that suppression, but on ongoing basis. So if you have chronic anxiety, even you might not even be aware of it, it might gradually reduce the activity of prefrontal cortex just by a little bit, making it that much harder to create change, to think clearly. It can create like mind fog. It can create overthinking and just kind of negative mind chatter. So that's kind of the main mechanism that seems to be kind of hijacking change of any kind. When there isn't enough familiarity, there isn't enough safety, and in general, if there is strong emotional overload in the system.
Wow, that's super important to know, and I don't think many people are aware of that. I wasn't until recently. So another question I'd like to ask now, Gabija, is what would you say the most important things are that people should know about the brain if they want to make changes in their life? And maybe here we could talk about how the brain is kind of, there's different modules, and different modules have different functions. Am I getting that right? And maybe we could talk about Phineas Gage here for a second as well, if you feel like bringing that in.
Yeah, so there is a kind of general, misconception that the brain is so mysterious and we know so little about. But actually, the big issue is that we know probably too much about it, that it's kind of clouding maybe big picture. But the facts are that one of the most kind of investigating field of neuroscience is what each area of the brain is responsible for. Because over the years, we kind of were able to study people who had damage to the brain. And some of them had really, really localized, very specific damage. So for example, after the Second World War, a lot of soldiers were coming back with injuries to specific areas due to the, the shatters of the explosion and so on. And that same happens with stroke patients and other kind of patients which have so-called localized lesions. And one of the first cases was so-called the case of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was, I think he died in 1860s. So he lived quite a long time ago, 150 years ago, 170 years ago. And he was a really lovely man, actually. It was similar to you now, he was really responsible, really pleasant, really could kind of cared about people, and it was really good at kind of making sure his employees were kind of really well looked after, was really proactive, motivated, energetic. And that unfortunately has changed dramatically after the incident he had with when they were exploding the rocks. So he worked as a railway manager, and they were using those kind of just big metal rods to make a hole near the rocks they wanted to explode. And they would stuff that with explosive and just kind of, stuff it in with the metal rod. But of course, we know what happens when the metal hits the rock, right? So the heat was created, and the heat ignited the explosive. And that caused the explosion, which then metal rod just shot up in the air and crossed the jaw and the forehead of Phineas Gage. So it kind of, it went right through his front of the brain. And we know that area it's been prefrontal cortex. And to everyone's surprise, Phineas Gage has survived the incident. He's walked himself to the hospital, administered himself there, and even was able to talk and explain to the doctors what has happened. But one thing has changed irreversibly, which was his personality. He became really, really angry, really mean, really kind of, he wasn't motivated in doing anything else. He couldn't suppress his biological urges anymore. So he became highly promiscuous and highly violent as well. If he saw somebody that he didn't like, he would just go and try to, beat them up. So he became a real nuisance in the society, and that kind of, later on was confirmed by a number of other cases where people has damaged the prefrontal cortex, which basically then we know that this area is responsible for that. There was other areas, like area at the back, visual cortex allows us to see each other now. Area on the sides, temporal lobes, allow us to hear what we're saying and make sense of the words. Area at the top, parietal lobe, allow us to understand symbols such as numbers and letters, and think abstract thoughts such as you're thinking right now about the functioning of the brain and any other abstract things. So there's many areas on the outside, and this is the newest addition to the brain called neocortex. Now, when we go inside, so the brain has developed in evolutionary from the kind of, from the down out, basically. It's kind of building new layers on top of the old layers. So this is brainstem, which is so-called like the lizard brain, as the reptiles have similar area. And that allows us to control heartbeat, breathing, digestion, and all this kind of loads of areas in the middle there, which form the limbic system or the mammal brain, which I discussed earlier. And these are responsible for quite a lot of different things, but mainly creating emotions, communicating to us in the language of emotions about what's good for us and what's not. So emotions is a kind of mammal's brain way to give a summary of the situation you're in. And when we feel pleasure, it means like, okay, actually the mammal brain saying, okay, the situation is safe and you're doing something what's actually beneficial to you. If we feel fear, mammal brain says, actually something about it is not quite right. Maybe you're doing something that's too unfamiliar for you. Maybe the change you're making is just too big, and there isn't enough, kind of support on the way. Or it could be sometimes when we get so-called gut feeling that originates there as well. And those emotions are created from really quite intelligent processes in the mammal brain. They take into account everything. Like, has it ever happened to you now that you've been around a person and something didn't feel right? Yeah. So that's mammal brain taking into account body tone, smell, positioning, how they talk. And mammal brain is really good detecting what's genuine and what's not. So in other words, we can't really fool the mammal brain. We can, in a way, fool the rational brain because it takes really, really long time to process everything. But mammal brain creates so-called crude and quick summary. And sometimes it makes mistakes, needless to say, right? But it's kind of just different functions. And prefrontal cortex job is, in contrast to that, to analyze situation really accurately, but it takes loads of energy and really long time in comparison to do so. So they kind of complement each other to make sure that we're kind of well-rounded and well-functioning people.
Wow, that's fascinating. And it's incredible to think that that one area of the brain like is almost responsible for making us human and enables us to get by in society and inhibit some of these really ancient biological drives that we all have, and if that goes wrong, then
and funnily enough, it's not even needed for that to be damaged, for us to actually become not dissimilar from Phineas Gage, right? Like as I discussed before, like just overly active amygdala, overly active mammal brain can actually inhibit it. Also, too much pleasure can inhibit it. So just if you think about the time when you really kind of maybe were in love with somebody, and were you objective about that person at that given time, right? And that's the same mechanism. So the other area within mammal brain called ventral tegmental area, which creates that big pleasure, when we're around a person we truly are fond of, and especially if we're attracted to them. And it's kind of, it inhibits the prefrontal cortex. And that's why often, we end up with people who actually are not necessarily whom we would choose rationally, but mammal brain kind of suppresses the prefrontal cortex and kind of blocks the things we don't want to see. Because a lot of things which later on become deal breakers were obvious from the beginning if you kind of were capable to think about it at that time. And that happens also with other things like, addiction. When we actually are really kind of addicted to something, it changes the way we think and the way we perform. Depression and other kind of mental, emotional illnesses, states, you can call it, can affect the way prefrontal cortex functions. Being really, really tired, or like not being able to sleep properly, if somebody has insomnia, or just in general works too long hours and doesn't get enough downtime to replenish, or if somebody has a just newborn baby and just is not capable to sleep, it doesn't have the luxury to do so, that can affect the functioning of prefrontal cortex temporarily, but quite dramatically. Alcohol, another perfect example. So we can actually see those things, kind of even in more day-to-day life. But the good news is that it's reversible. If we get enough rest, if our emotional state changes, if the effects of alcohol wear off, the brain normally gets back to normal.
Cool. Well, you've touched on it briefly already, Gabija, but one of the things that you mentioned in your lecture with us was this triune model of the brain. I'm probably saying that wrong, but just how the brain's kind of divided into three broad areas, and that these areas require differing levels of energy. And I think you use a metaphor of vehicles to describe that. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that there.
Yeah, it's a bit of simplification, to be honest, but it is let's look at it as a metaphor. because things are more complex than that. But it's a good approximation just to start thinking about, the needs of different areas of the brain. So as I discussed, all the outer layer of the brain, neocortex, in the Paul MacLean's Triune brain model, he calls that human brain. It might be a bit misleading, human brain within the human brain, or neo-mammalian complex, but human brain for short. And the limbic system inside, which is creates emotions, he calls mammalian complex. And as a kind of name implies, other mammals have those areas as well. And this is this kind of cerebellum and brainstem, being lizard brain or reptilian complex. And he kind of created a model, from comparing anatomy of different brains of different animals and how they function. And during my both master's and PhD research, I did research on different brains of different animals as well. And, needless to say, a lot of those findings we get from animal brains, especially from the, those low, more ancient centers, still kind of can be applied to understanding human research. The kind of special neocortex is also found in mammals, but much, much less developed, and especially prefrontal cortex is nothing to compare with other animals. I think we are kind of the masters of our prefrontal cortex in the animal kingdom. And those centers, they kind of been developed for different things, and therefore they consume different amounts of energy. And lizard brain, taking care of all of our kind of vital needs, requires very little energy, but it's always active. So it always makes sure that your heart is beating, your lungs are working properly, your digestive system is working properly, and we don't need to think about it rationally. It does things automatically, day and night, doesn't stop. Now, a mammal brain requires more energy, and it creates things such as old habit. So the reason we create habits is to make it more energy efficient. So when we do things automatically, such as driving a car or walking or writing or talking, once it's became a habit, it doesn't require that much energy. When we're just learning those things, it requires prefrontal cortex, and overall it requires other centers of neocortex or human brain, and that's extremely energy expensive, but also it requires full attention. It requires actually being really, really engaged in it. It's like if you can you drive, Anil?
Yeah.
So if you remember the first time you actually were learning to drive, I assume you couldn't do anything else, just fully focused on driving, right? And that happened to me, needless to say. Like, my husband couldn't talk. I was like, there could be no radio or any conversations in that car at that point. Okay, once we kick enough practice in, then mammal brain centers take over that function, and it's much, much easier and much, much more energy efficient to do that. And we can do that even on autopilot then, can drive and think about something else, listen to the audiobook, and it doesn't require the mental focus to it. Now, one issue with all standing habits is when we are tired, if we don't have enough energy to run our human brain, even if we want to do the new thing, we revert back to the old habits. Also, when we're undergoing some sort of emotional stress, we are much more likely to revert back to the old mammal brain habits. So that's one of the kind of biggest challenges I see in people trying to change habits and coming back to the old habits, is really making sure that there is enough space, time, and energy for the actual new habit to be created.
That seems like such an important point, that, if you want to make a change, one of the most important things to get right is your energy levels, and to make sure that you just got enough energy in the tank so that you can make these changes, and that you don't revert back to your old habits. Because I've definitely tried to do that myself, and tried to take on too many things at once, and the changes never stick. So it seems that you just have to really have the energy, focus on one thing, and get it right.
And I think it's very important actually at any stage in life, but in particular when you want to create change, is really kind of reduce the amount of busyness, because it's not only energy actually, because some people say, oh, if I ate more, could I actually, you know, have more energy for my brain? That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way, because all the brain centers, but in particular prefrontal cortex, need downtime. So if we learn something, we actually need some time for the brain to process it inside. You know, once we actually, if you read like, let's say, an article or watched this interview, you know, wow, you know, I learned a lot of new things here. It's actually better to take a break and not to watch another lecture straight away, to go and make yourself a cup of tea, just sit and relax and just kind of let your brain just absorb the information. And also that night, you have to make sure to get good sleep, because information actually is converted from short term to long term when we actually have so-called mind wandering time. If you're just sitting and looking through the window and just doing shoo-ba-doo-ba-doo, actually that your brain is working really hard in actually process other information you learned before. Or when we sleep or nap or so on, that happens as well. So I think rest and recovery time is very important for brain functioning.
Okay, so Gabija, now I'd like to talk a bit more about neuroplasticity. So what would you say the key things that people should know about neuroplasticity are? Like, what are some of the key ideas, and what is neuroplasticity for someone that's never heard of the concept before?
That's a very important topic to talk about. So in the brain, there's many changes taking place. So first change is that the brain cells, called neurons, they're connected with one another in so-called networks. And everything we know, everything we can feel, is represented in some sort of network. So for me now to remember the face of my mom, I need to activate face of my mom recognition network. For me to sit on the chair, I need to activate sitting on the chair brain network, and so on. So we create those networks when we learn the information. And basically that's one form of plasticity, is creating new networks from all this huge amount of neurons in the brain. So, and then those networks change all the time. The networks you use more frequently get stronger and stronger over time. And the ones you use less frequently get weakened to a point where actually they might even completely be reused for other networks. And that's the reason why a lot of people, you know, who learned, let's say, foreign language at school and never used that afterwards, they kind of become less and less proficient in the language as the time goes by. And also why, you know, memories from childhood kind of fade away with the years. So that's just a natural process, unless you work actively revisiting them. And that's the process which can enable us to learn and to become better and better at things as well. Now, there is in one area of the brain called anti-gyrus, we also even have new neurons being born. We don't fully understand what's that for, but there is actually more. That's another element of plasticity as well. In order for the kind of, and also actually the neurons can die in the brain as well, if neurons are not being used, or if there is some sort of inflammation happening in the brain, or when people experience stroke, the neurons die as well. So that's another kind of element to take into account. Now, brain plasticity on all of those factors mentioned is a plastic process. So what it means that actually the more new information you encounter, the more plastic your brain becomes. Because brain plasticity really requires quite a lot of energy. And if you're doing exactly the same thing every day, and not encountering anything new, there is no need to keep maintaining that, you know, ability of the brain to change. But if you suddenly, you know, kind of change your life completely and start doing completely new things, it takes some time for brain plasticity to get more active. So the ways to actually increase brain plasticity is learning new things. It could be like reading, you know, learning foreign language, learning to play a music instrument, doing new physical exercise, kind of learning any new skill whatsoever, watching lectures like this one, and so on. Now, second one is physical exercise. Actually, physical exercise, especially like the exercise such as walking or jogging, is actually, or cycling, is very good for brain plasticity. We can't know for sure why that is, but one of the hypotheses states that when we lived in hunter-gatherer times, people usually lived in specific location and foraged food around them. But when they were walking long distances, they were very likely to encounter a completely new environment, and they needed to be really quick in learning that what's in that environment, or else they were hunted by predators.
Yeah.
That's one of the hypotheses why that plasticity is increased when we actually do those aerobic exercises for a prolonged period of time.
That's fascinating. I heard in your lecture with us as well, you mentioned that, whenever we're doing this exercise, it releases a chemical called BDNF. Maybe I'm getting that right, or getting it wrong. But also that it's important that we enjoy the exercise we do, that if we're just doing something that's boring, that doesn't get released, and we don't get brain plasticity. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So when we're doing the physical activities that feel pleasant, BDNF is secreted. BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, when we do something we are forced to do, or if we're forcing ourselves to do, or if we experience enormous amount of stress. So I used to cycle in the velodrome in London. And I love cycling, but actually, and I was fairly good sprinting in the velodrome. And I started competing amateurly there, and it was causing me so much stress that I bet there was no benefit to my brain. Because when we experience stress, it actually reduces brain plasticity.
Okay.
It probably counterbalances, the effects of physical exercise. It's very important to do exercise in a way that doesn't feel stressful for you, or it can be eustress, like the kind of if you kind of like having little challenges and it kind of feels good for you, it's great. If it feels overwhelming, forceful, unpleasant, that won't cause you any benefit, at least for your brain.
Awesome. So just to summarize that, so the key things to increase brain plasticity are to exercise, to learn new things. Anything else people can do to?
And also to sleep. Sleep is one
Sleep.
of the best things, because when we sleep, new neurons are being born during that time, information is being processed, and new networks are being created. So sleep and recovery time, getting enough time to rest.
Okay, awesome. I love those three things, so I'm going to do more of them. So could you tell us about the London black cab drivers and the differences between their brains and the bus drivers? Because I find that really interesting.
Yeah, that was really, really elegant study done by the Professor Eleanor Maguire at UCL. And she was interested, she was working on hippocampus, or brain area, which is crucial for navigation and memory. And my PhD was interested in the whole phenomena as well. And she decided to compare the size of hippocampi, plural, because we have two brain hemispheres. So there's one hippocampus on this side and one on this side. So plural would be hippocampi. So the hippocampi of black cab drivers to the hippocampi of the bus drivers. And she found staggering differences, as black cab drivers have much larger hippocampi, which presumably, indicated much more function in those centers, in comparison to the bus drivers who actually took, the same route. And if you're not familiar, in order to become black cab driver, you have to go through really extensive training, which requires you to learn 10,000 streets, enormous amounts of kind of, I might be mixing the numbers. Could it be 10,000 streets? Sounds quite a lot of streets, doesn't it? So basically around Charing Cross in London, I think you need to learn 10 miles around everything. All the streets, all the objects of interest, and you need to learn all the best routes. So they basically can't use the sat nav. They need to know everything by heart. And people take, anywhere from 3 to 7 years to kind of keep on driving on those little motorcycles to kind of learn these routes, to learn all these objects. It's really extensive training. And I remember once when I took a cab, and I got chatting to the cab driver. He had PhD in physics. He raised 3 children, and he earned property in London. And he said becoming a black cab driver was the hardest thing he's ever done.
Wow.
So it is really, really extensive training. Now, then Eleanor thought, like, okay, well, does it mean that actually people who have larger hippocampi become black cab drivers and the ones who have smaller one become bus drivers, or does it change as they actually are, driving and learning? So she took a bunch of people who were just starting the training to become black cab drivers, called the knowledge training. And then she scanned the brain at the beginning of the training and after 3 years. And also she qualified some of those people successfully passed the exam, while others actually failed and weren't capable to learn enough of that, what they required to learn in terms of navigation. And what she found was really incredible, that within the short space of 3 years, the hippocampi grew much, much larger, but only for the ones who actually successfully passed the exam.
Wow.
And for the ones who actually didn't succeed, on average, there was no significant difference. So that was one of the first times that so-called activity-dependent brain plasticity was shown in humans. We had a lot of research findings in rats of that, and that's why Eleanor thought that it might happen. But that was the first really good and very clever experiment to show that in humans. And then later on, there was more people within the same department doing other studies showing how it actually hippocampi change, even if we're just walking on the treadmill in the virtual reality. Like if there was, I've forgotten the name of the researcher, but he used virtual reality and the treadmill to help elderly people to kind of keep their brains active, and especially if they're in care homes or, they can't just walk around or drive around. And they showed that actually the same benefits happen, but they have to actually physically move. Just, playing computer game with virtual reality doesn't necessarily do the same effect.
It's such an incredible idea to think that by learning these things, or by learning new skills, and that we're physically changing the structure of our brains, and that these black cab drivers actually had a bigger hippocampi than people that didn't pass. It's incredible. But now, Gabby, I'd like to transition into talking about some of the practical ways people can change. So I think there was a study done in 2016 where they looked at New Year's resolutions, and they found that it was something like 80% of people failed their New Year's resolutions by the second week in February. And you're writing a book now on change and on behavior change. So why do you think people find it so hard to make changes in their life? Like, what are the common roadblocks you see in the work that you do?
I think if I was to summarize in one sentence, is that we have unrealistic expectations on our brains and on ourselves overall. But we kind of, a lot of times, we try to change in a way that goes against how our brain functions. We think the pure willpower will create a change. That's not realistic. We kind of fail to manage the workload and energy load, and that's big component to it. And also we kind of don't transition between the stages required we need to go through in order to create a lasting change. Because I think to create a quick short-term change is very easy, but to create a lasting change, that's what's hard, because that requires building new networks, strengthening them over time, and weakening the old networks, which takes lots of practice and lots of time. And I think, unfortunately, when we try to change too many things all at once, it's just not possible to do that for all of them. So we really have to be very selective and very methodological in order to create change. So firstly, we want to really make sure that we reduce other things happening, both in terms of mental load and emotional load, that we change one thing at a time, and we actually do very, very small steps to start with. And in general, like overall, from my coaching clinic, I can see that human nature is being impatient. We want things quickly. We can't wait for things to happen, especially if it's things we really, really want, right? Somebody really wants to make the new business grow and become successful. They might be really impatient and quit the job and put all the eggs in one basket. But the brain doesn't deal with those changes very, very well. On average, there is exceptions where kind of those things work out well. So I think it's kind of learning. I think so. My kind of approach overall is actually firstly learning what does your brain need to create a change, and then actually planning your strategy of change according to that, as opposed to just kind of taking things from the common sense or general knowledge, which a lot of times is misleading and doesn't actually provide what the brain needs to change.
Brilliant, brilliant. And you gave a lecture with us in January at our day on behavior change, and it was the first ever weekend university that my dad's ever been to, right? And I've been trying to get my dad to like eat healthier and like change his health habits for years. And he actually took something from your lecture and he's implemented it to like change his health habits, right? It's this 5-stage model that you give. It's like, it's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation. Could you maybe tell us about this 5-stage model and how people can use this to change?
Yeah, so that model again is a bit of a metaphor. It's not necessarily based on neuroscience, but it's just quite a helpful way to think about it, because we often kind of jump into the change immediately. But we have to go through the stages to prepare ourselves for that change. And in the pre-contemplation stage, we really kind of are not even aware what needs to be changed. In contemplation stage, we kind of start, thinking through what exactly do we need to change. And there are certain tips that could change in that. In preparation stage, we actually need to really prepare our life for that change. So reduce activity of other things, reduce emotional loads, and kind of get very, very specific. And only then there is actually the change stage where we actually create a change. But it has to be in a way that still meets a lot of safety for our mammal brain. And last but not least, the last stage is where we actually make the change last. So basically repeating the new habit for long enough for it to actually to create strong and lasting brain networks. And a lot of times people ask me, how long shall I repeat it? And there is no quick answer to that. Or kind of there is because each habit is so different and each person is different. So it's kind of, it's hard to really estimate, but we are talking about the number of months rather than the number of days usually.
Yeah. So that's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, taking action, and maintenance. That's the five stages. A final question I'd like to ask you here, Gabija, is about habits. So when we've got a habit that we've identified as something that's not good for our lives, whether it's smoking or maybe drinking too much coffee, or I don't know, just a bad habit, that seems to be meeting some kind of basic human need.
So there is no such thing as bad habit.
Okay.
If we do it, it means we get something out of it.
Okay.
First, we need to identify what is it that we're getting out of it. And somebody would say, like, well, what can I get out of smoking a cigarette? I hate it, I just can't stop it. No, you get something out of it. So if you really don't know what that is, watch what happens right before you do that. So for me, like, my kind of drug of choice is sugar. So I love Kinder chocolate, is my favorite one, right? So when do I have it? Is when I feel anxious, when I feel lonely, perhaps. Right? So that kind of that emotional need of lack of safety is met when I have sugar. So kind of going back and really identify what that is. Once we identify the need, then we have to really specifically think what else could help to meet the need. So if it's loneliness that triggers my craving for Kinder chocolate, maybe I should call my husband or call my brother, right? Or my other family members. And getting human contact. Maybe I should go and, you know, socialize with some people, or go and give a seminar and talk to attendees of a seminar. That's actually my favorite way of socializing. And in that way, the need is being met in the way which is actually more beneficial to me. And in fact, that allows me to meet more needs than that. So, but if we actually live, so a lot of those, what we call bad habits, is just escapism from emotions we don't want to feel, or meeting the kind of those basic human needs. And if I was to just quickly go through the 6 basic needs, if that's helpful. So first one is safety, which we discussed a number of times, and that's crucial need. And sometimes if we have too much challenge, even getting in depressed state is the way to meet the safety need, because I kind of almost close off from all the threat and danger into that kind of, you know, space where very little exists. Then second one is variety. So we all need some sort of variety and novelty. And sometimes sometimes procrastination is driven by that. If your job is really like very repetitive, and especially if you kind of don't really enjoy it anymore, a lot of people procrastinate to meet the need of variety. So then finding other ways to meet that variety, maybe learning something new, maybe, you know, asking your line manager, what else can I do? Can I learn something? Can I take any new responsibilities? Maybe manage someone, or maybe start business on the side, or whatever that is. The third need is significance. And we can meet significance in the ways that are helpful, like, you know, doing a really amazing job, giving compliment to somebody and so on. Or we can meet significance via putting somebody down, or criticizing, or doing other kind of things that procrastination, actually, some people meet significance from being like the serial procrastinators, or the people who are always late to the meetings and so on. So being honest, and for each person it will be different motivation of even this very similarly looking behavior. Now, fourth need from the basic needs is connection. We all need to feel that my actions and my existence has an effect on other people. And again, we can meet that, you know, via interacting and connecting with like-minded people, making a nice dinner for your loved ones, or criticizing them, putting them down, because they're kind of seeing an effect in another person. That's what kind of creates their need. And needless to say, if we meet any of those needs in the way that's not sustainable, we'll experience all sorts of emotions such as shame, guilt, and so on, trying to steer us back to being on the track, to meeting those needs in a healthy and constructive way. So usually when we actually use emotional escapisms to run away from those emotions of shame, guilt, blame, we actually not necessarily, inquiring, are we meeting those needs in a healthy way? Now, if we do meet those 4 needs in a healthy and constructive way, then we can meet other 2, which are growth, and, you know, becoming better self over the time, and contribution, or making other people's lives better as a result of what you do. So all of those, you know, then combination of those 6 needs and the way we meet, they form our daily habits, our kind of trajectory of life as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. It actually reminded me of Johan Hari. Do you know him? He gave a TED talk on addiction. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I came across his work through his book Lost Connections. Depression. He refers a little bit to that, but yeah, I think addictions is very, very much linked to the meeting needs in that destructive way.
Yeah, it's just like he's saying the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And all these, our addictions and our bad habits are just maybe just bad strategies for getting, I don't know if bad's the right word, but they're just alternative strategies for getting these basic needs met. And if we can figure out what the needs are, we can find more healthy strategies for fulfilling them.
I probably wouldn't put it all to connection. I think connection and human contact is very important need to meet. It's one of the top ones. But people can get addicted if they feel insignificant. life. I mean, if you take connection in the wider sense, yes, as he does actually in the later book, the connection to all sorts of things. But you know, if somebody's like really have, like, let's imagine somebody has huge dream to, I don't know, to, let's say, write a book, but they actually not, for one or another reason, they're not doing that. You know, maybe they feel that they can't and so on. So they can get distracted into very addictive habits of doing other things and feel bad themselves about it. And it's kind of that the emotion that's called constantly is coming up. If they're numbing with something else like sugar, it's just helping them to escape from that significance and maybe contribution and growth actually they would meet while writing the book. And it's something so important to them that they can't forget about it. It still exists in their mind. So I think it's kind of, in general, it's quite good to do a bit of the inventory of those needs. What I like to do with my coaching clients is I draw 6 glasses and ask them, and like imagine in each glass is dedicated for each need. And ask them how much water is in your glass of safety. And if they say, oh, actually 4, I feel really unsafe right now. Well, okay, well, what are the kind of habits that you engage in when you feel unsafe? And then it will, you know, actually I watch telly and do a lot of escapism things. I drink alcohol, eat sugar, and so on. So that gives a bit of insight. Then, you know, variety, how much variety you have, and so on and so forth. So we go through each of those glasses and do a bit of inventory, how much they're meeting each need. And then we ask, how can we identify which glass has least water? And then we ask, what is one thing I could do to get a little bit more water in that glass? Right? And for somebody, like if somebody's meeting safety in a really, you know, insufficient manner, perhaps waking up at exactly the same time every day, and having a morning ritual could make a huge difference. Or having, maybe pairing up with somebody in their work and kind of having, you know, collaboration to feel safe about the performance could help. Or any way that feels meaningful and sustainable for that person. And in general, when we talk about change, it has to always be personalized. There is no kind of one size fits all. Okay, there is certain universal laws of how the brain functions, but each brain is unique. So it really requires going through the process to really figure that out. And that's the very reason I'm writing the book. And if I may share, the title is Why the Fuck Can't I Change? You know, it's like, it's really about that frustration people experience when they keep trying to change and try getting everyone's advice how they should change, but they're more and more stuck over the years. And they're more frustrated and angry themselves for not being able to change. So my personal take is, you really need to learn, how does your brain function? What does it need? And have those, I introduce in my book I share lots of coaching techniques, or what tools, like coaching tools I developed over the years of coaching practice that kind of are compatible with those neuroscience insights of how to actually do the work on your own individual situation and how to apply it in practice.
Brilliant. Well, Gabija, it's been absolutely incredible to talk to you. I've really enjoyed this. Where can people find you online? I know you've got the books when's the book coming out?
January.
January, okay. How can people keep updated on that? Do you have a newsletter or something people can check out? Or
Probably, I'm just thinking the best, they could join me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. My Facebook page is called, I just changed it recently, Empower Your Brain. Or I will add, my website is called My Brain During the Day, and they can sign up to the newsletter, where I actually share all the updates of the book and certain chapters of the book, or any lectures I have available online.